There's a gospel statement which is very mysterious. Knock and the door will open. Ask and you will receive. Seek and you'll find. And that, on the face of it, seems utterly preposterous, because could the world possibly be laid out in that manner? That seems too good to be true. And you've asked plenty and haven't received. It's like, yeah, maybe not. Because you got to ask yourself what ask would mean. It might mean something like, well, first of all, you got have your head screwed on straight about who you are. It's like, are you willing to act in your own best interest? And that doesn't mean, are you willing to give rein to your impulsive hedonism? The problem with impulsive hedonism, and that's sort of at the core of what we tend to describe as selfishness. Because a selfish person is an impulsive hedonist who will sacrifice other people to that impulsive hedonism. And the reason I say impulsive hedonism is because it's impulsive because you want what you want right now. And you want it regardless of its future costs. And that might be future costs even for you. When you act impulsively, you go out and you party too much, let's say. You have too much fun. And you're burning tomorrow and the next couple of days to exaggerate the intensity of what you have right now. And that everyone knows, or you learn soon, that that's just not sustainable. You have to treat yourself in the moment in a way that doesn't interfere with how you're going to function tomorrow and next week and a month from now and next year and 5 years down the road. You can't sacrifice the future for the present. If you're an impulsive hedonist, you're not exactly selfish. You're selfish and immature. And you're selfish because it's about you, but you're stupidly selfish because it's about you now. And that's just unwise in every sense of the word. The younger you are, and I mean chronologically, the more impulsive and hedonically oriented in some deep sense you are. 2-year-olds are very impulsive. And that's why we don't let them set up colonies and live independently. They can't govern their behavior with regards to future consequences. They're not mature and wise enough to have that breadth of view. And hopefully, as you mature, you become capable of regulating your behavior in the present so that your own path at least stays steady, but hopefully even goes uphill. And so that's back to this rule, is treat yourself like you're someone you are responsible for helping, is that I think in some real sense you want to enter into the kind of relationship with yourself that's also marked in its highest manner by the spirit of play. And we know this too. We look for experiences like this all the time to put us in that place, although we don't necessarily notice that that's what we're doing. When you go to a concert, you go to hear musicians play. And when you go to a dramatic production, a movie, you see people playing a part. And the playing part of that isn't trivial. And you go there to participate in the play. And you do the same thing when you go to a sports event. And you do it in an embodied way. And it's so interesting to watch. If you're watching a football game and some remarkable player makes a remarkable shot, you'll jump up to your feet and throw your arms in the air before you even notice, right? It's completely spontaneous. It's completely bottom up. It's not that much different than what you do when you're at a comedy show and you spontaneously laugh, right? You don't think, that's a funny joke, I should laugh. There's no thought between the joke and the catching of the punchline and the spontaneous reaction. And you do that because you want to experience that sense of play. And we'll pay for the privilege of being in a place that's setting that up, is facilitating it. And we all regard that, especially when it's going well, and maybe you're going to listen to a great band. It's a genre that really speaks to you, and the band just gets cooking, and everyone knows what that means, and it means they're playing off each other. That often happens when they're good at improvising, so they're not just doing it note for note, although that can be great. But it's even better when they could do it note for note, but then start to play, and they just get into a rhythm that's something else. And if it's really working well, then everyone in the whole place is in the same rhythm, and it's all pulsing with the same beat, let's say. And everyone's just thrilled out of their mind, which is why there's like 50,000 people doing it. And it's useful to know, what are you doing there? And the answer seems to be, you're playing along with your favorite band. That's a pretty good deal, because you got these highly skilled, creative people up front doing their best, allowing you to mimic that in some real sense as part of the experience. People will sing along and they'll dance. That's all mimicry. You can't help but dance. That's all part of the spirit of play. And so you treat yourself like you're someone responsible for helping. It's a serious injunction, even though its aim is play. And this is part of asking, too, before you receive. It's like, okay, give yourself the benefit of the doubt, even though it's hard, given your appalling, pathetic, ignorant, lazy nature, and all the things you could be that you aren't. It's hard to give yourself the benefit of the doubt, but you could say, well, would it really be so terrible if my life wasn't miserable? Would it be so terrible if I got what I wanted and needed, especially if I was doing that in the best possible way? And that has to be a serious question, right? You can't just tell yourself this. You have to open yourself up to the possibility that that might be true. Then you can say to yourself, well, if I could have what I needed and wanted in a manner that would be best for me, and you can imagine that takes a fair bit of orientation to get that question right, then what would my life look like? And that's a frightening question. People generally are loath to ask themselves that question because there's a couple of reasons. One is, maybe you feel you don't deserve it. Well, another is you don't know that that's what you should do because we're so badly taught that this idea is generally not presented to people, which is just absolutely appalling beyond belief as far as I can tell. But then there's more impediments too, because one of the things people do to buttress themselves against failure is to never let themselves really gain clarity about what they need and want. Let's say you try something, but you only do it half-heartedly. And then you fail, and you think, well, I didn't really fail because, I held a bunch back in reserve, and so I didn't get what I wanted, but maybe had I been all in, I would have. And so you don't have to upbraid yourself too much for the failure. Now, it's a catastrophic way to live, to sit on the fence and to not commit, because instead of risking the possibility of failure, you engage in what's essentially the absolute certainty of failure. Because if you want something worthwhile and difficult, which you probably do if you want to have an adventure and go somewhere, then what's the chance you're going to get it if you're halfway in? It's like, if you can, then you didn't aim high enough, obviously, and that's not going to be exciting or engaging. And so if you're actually pursuing something that would motivate you maximally, you can't be halfway in. But that sort of protects you against failure because you can tell yourself, well, if I tried, I could have done it. It's like, you tell yourself that 200 times and your life's over. And so I would seriously not recommend that. And then another problem is that if you let yourself know what you need and want, then you can betray yourself, right? So do you trust yourself? And the answer is, well, not really. And the reason is, well, I trusted myself before and I misbehaved terribly, so why would I do that again? And fair enough, that's a solid question. But on the other hand, if you don't let yourself know what you need and want, what's the probability that you're going to do a random walk in the right direction? Especially given that there's lots of ways to randomly walk, and there are very few pathways to what you really need and want. And so it's an act of faith. And I don't mean the belief in preposterous things. I mean an act of existential courage to ask yourself what you need and want. Imagine you wanted to live without bitterness. You want to live without cynicism. And maybe even more, you wanted to live in something approximating a spirit of play. What would you need and want to make that happen? Well, it's very terrifying to allow yourself to envision that. First of all, because you've made your conditions for failure very clear. Second, because you've set yourself up to betray yourself in a fundamental way. And third, often the apprehension of the distance between you and that goal can also be demoralizing and overwhelming. Now, I think the way you deal with that is you can make a lot of progress incrementally. Once you specify a goal, you don't have to leap from where you are to the goal in one fell swoop. If you could, you probably didn't set a difficult enough goal. It's okay to make incremental movement forward. That's why there's another rule here, which is compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. If you get the comparison right, you can say, well, here's where I'm headed and it's worth going to. You have to ask yourself that. Is there a place I could head to that would be worth getting to? And that's a question, right? It's a question like you might ask your wife. It's like, okay, if I could give you what you wanted, it's a good thing to ask during an argument, by the way. Really, it has to be an honest question. It's like, you're arguing with me. I don't know who's right. Neither of us, because we're both clueless and confused. It's like, if you could have what you wanted in this moment, and I could deliver it, what would it be? The general answer to that is something like, if you loved me, you'd know, which is not a helpful... How come you know that answer? It's not a helpful answer. It's like, no, I'm too stupid to know what you want, that's for sure. I mean, you don't even know what you want. So how in the world am I going to figure it out? But it's a lovely gift to offer your partner, by the way, the conditions for your satisfaction. But then you have to allow yourself to know what they are, and you have to be acting in your own best interest, and then that exposes you to all these potential calamities that we just described, and that's a big risk, but it's not nearly as big a risk as never getting what you want and need, and that is definitely the alternative. And that's a pathway to bitterness and cynicism and a wasted life. And bitterness and cynicism, that's just where that starts. It gets way worse as it compounds. And so it's very useful to treat yourself like you're someone you're responsible for helping. And it is very useful to compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. There's no way of interacting with someone, including yourself, that's more productive than to give targeted reward where credit is due, to give credit where credit is due. And you might say, well, how can I treat myself well, given that I'm nothing but the embodiment of serpentine, errors and sins? And the answer is, well, if you're a little better than you were previously, that's something. Really. And maybe that's what you want to see in your kids, right? I mean, you don't want to push them too far. You don't want to punish them if they haven't made huge leaps forward developmentally. What you want to see is incremental progress that requires some effort. And that's actually what your kids really love too. If they're playing hard, they're on the edge, they're pushing themselves to develop their skills, maybe they're playing a sport, they're pushing themselves to move incrementally at the optimum rate. That's another thing that play indicates, by the way. That's so cool to know too. Play signals that you're pushing yourself forward at the optimal rate. Because you can't stay static, and you can't absorb too much change at once. How do you know when it's right? Well, it's engaging, it's meaningful, but at the highest level, it's something like play. When you're playing a sport, you want to play against someone who's approximately the same level of skill as you, or maybe a little beyond, right? If you're playing a game with someone who's approximately your equal, and you're pushing each other exactly enough to facilitate optimal movement forward.